Welcome to Build. I'm your host, Matt Forte. We are here live at the Build studio in New York City. Now, before we dive in, just a really quick thank you to our friends over at Macy's for bringing a little bit of springtime into the Build studio. You may have noticed these wonderful floral displays behind me. Well, if you think that's nice, you got to head over to Macy's.com/flower show. It only comes once a year. There's one in New York, Chicago, San Francisco. It's an 80-year tradition. It's a super fun thing to do. The displays are amazing, guys. So hit it up, check it out, Macy's.com/flower show. Thanks, guys. All right, our first guest today has garnered critical acclaim for his myriad of creative endeavors. He's the co-founder of the All-American High School Film Festival. Has created documentaries for ESPN, HBO, CNN, MTV, just to name a few. His podcast, What Really Happened, recently hit #1 on iTunes, which is no small feat. And he'll be bringing this wildly popular show to the stage for the very first time, April 8th, in a special live event with the NYC Podfest. But first, he's right here with me on Build. I'm super excited to talk to him. Folks, please welcome the great Andrew Jenks. Make some noise.
Thank you.
Welcome, man.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'm so excited to talk to you. Congratulations on everything.
Thank
Number
you.
1, the season 1, season 2 coming soon.
Season 2,
Yeah.
September.
September. Oh, fantastic. So exciting. And there's a lot to talk to, so I want to dive right in. I'm going to ask you a question that I think you get asked a million times, but I want to get a baseline here. You're a notoriously prolific documentarian. What brought you into this new medium, this new format? Take me to the beginning before we go into the future.
So the beginning. So I was meeting with $7 Productions, which is Dwayne Johnson, Danny Garcia,
Never heard
Ryan
of them.
Gewirtz. Yeah, I don't know. And so I had this idea that I'd been trying to make a short documentary on for years about this one time in 1981 when Muhammad Ali talked a guy out of committing suicide. The guy was on the 9th floor of an office building. He was like, I'm gonna jump. For 2 hours, people were looking up, wondering what was gonna happen. A cop went up there. I think a priest went up there. And then out of nowhere, Muhammad Ali shows up. He goes up, the police allow him to go up, and within 30 minutes, he talks the guy from coming down. And I started to look into it because I'm a sports fan. I've made a couple 30 for 30s, and I was like, I've never heard this before. Yeah. So I started to research and look into it, and certain parts of the story weren't adding up. And I'm not a conspiracy theory guy. I'm just like, what was the source? There was no like original information on this. And so I called the LAPD. They didn't have the police records of that day, and just so essentially I told this to $7 Productions, and what's great about them is they were like, so you're thinking of this as a short film, is there a way to expand this or make it bigger? Are there other examples like this? And so I took a look, just researching different historical events, public figures, things that I was always curious about, and so we expanded that into a series where the Ali story that I just told you is the first episode. Yeah. And so that's where it began. And
at what point do you take all of your skills and all of the knowledge you've acquired and all these films you've made and chop off half of that and go, we're not going to do it visually, we're going to do just audio?
That is the craziest part, because I'm so, exactly how you just said, I lost 50% of the devices I'm used to. Yeah. So it's so much more raw in a sense. It's an audio documentary. And so because of that, I think of it as like a campfire test. Can I sit you down for an hour, or maybe you're in transit or you're cleaning your apartment or whatever it is, but for an hour, can I keep you entertained? Yeah. Like at a dinner table. And that is a kind of an awesome challenge and a difficult one, and that's where people like the guys at $7 Productions or Cadence 13 will remind me like, hey, we've been listening to you for 45 minutes. You need to remind us who Jerry from 1985, there's so many different moving parts. Yeah. And so the worst thing you can do is not be clear in the story, and it gets confusing or something. And then the person's gonna just, move on to another podcast or what have you. So it's been weird for me to think of it just audio-wise. Like
About how long do you think it took for you to make that adjustment and to sort of adapt this skill set? Because there are some tools from that box that do cross over. There is an overlap, but you are doing something completely different at the same time. So I imagine there's an adjustment phase.
Yeah, there's definitely an adjustment phase. I think people think podcasts are easier.
Right.
So a lot of times someone will say, "Oh, you're doing a podcast. What else are you working on?" And I'm like, no. This like 6 episodes is a 18-hour a day, seven day a week thing, and to just barely pull it off. And so I made 2 short documentaries in addition to longer ones, and I always said the shorter ones were harder because you have so much story and so many places to go, and you only have 9 minutes. And there's that old quote. I forget what it's something like someone wrote someone a letter, and at the end of the letter they wrote, I'm sorry, if I had more time I would have made this shorter. And it's a lot harder to do do something with less. And so it's been a lot more time consuming, but in an enjoyable way. I like it.
Yeah, I think there is something too, like as a consumer, as someone on the outside who's watching these things that we make, when something is shorter or faster or it's brief, you always assume, well, they didn't try as hard. That must have been really easy. But the truth is, paring things down, when you really get into the thick of it, in a creative process, you're flush with ideas and you've got to dial it back. What was the original length of episode 1 of What Really Happened before you learned that?
Oh, man. I mean, episode 1... probably came in at like 2 hours and 10 minutes, and then I got it down to maybe like 1:05, I think. Yeah. But I mean, just talking about the creative process, I didn't think I'd bring this up, but one of the smaller things that's kind of interesting as well is even commercials in podcasts are awesome. Yeah. In that. Like when I have if I've had a television show or what have you, you go to the commercials and the commercials are what the commercials are. And there's act breaks. So it's like, if you have a 30-minute show on TV, generally speaking, that's about 22 minutes and 50 seconds. Yeah. Or if it's an hour show, it's about 44:40. And with a podcast, you're like, you want to please the advertisers because they're the ones paying the bills. But you're like, all right, it's weird if at 10 minutes, I say that someone died, and then we're going to cut to a Tide commercial. Yeah. So it's like, let's wait 2 more minutes or 2 minutes earlier so that it's at a more appropriate time. And in the end, it just makes for, I think everyone wins because it's more seamless, it's more organic, all those sorts of things.
Well, you do a great job, too, of providing like a personal context within your ad, which I think is necessary, especially with your type of podcast, when people come to associate your voice with someone who's in search of facts and you're a reliable voice of truth. So when an ad does arrive, you do contextualize even the ad. You're contextualizing.
I spend a lot of time on the ad. So normally you read an ad, so you're like, go to ZipRecruiter.com and get your free trial. But I try and come up with a whole story around.
It's amazing. It makes it part of the story.
Yeah, it's just like if you're gonna spend a minute on an ad, you might as well make it a good ad. Yeah. So I try and do that, which.
I want to get as deep into the process as we can because I'm fascinated by how you research, because you don't have a research team to my knowledge. You do the research, right? For the most part.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so have you found, because between Ali and Brittany and Christy and all the stories you've covered, you've covered multiple instances across multiple decades. Has it been easier to establish what a fact was back in the day? Have you seen how a fact is defined evolve as media's evolved, and as you've covered these different moments in history? As we get to a time like today, I shudder at the thought of you having to do this in 20 years about what's going on now and finding the facts. Have you noticed anything like that as you've gone throughout time?
I think that I think years ago I would have thought, okay, with more information being out there, it'll be much easier to get the facts. Yeah. I think it actually takes now much longer, but you have the opportunity to get closer to the facts, if that makes any sense. So you have to be much more diligent. So if I read a book on King John II, I have to read at least 3 other books to really understand. Like, for instance, there's this one, a lot of people these days are talking about how Hitler was on a lot of drugs. And there was this one book that got a lot of attention. And so I didn't just read the book, I read a lot about the author, because he had written 3 books prior to that were fiction books. If you're writing fiction books and now you're writing a nonfiction book, you could have a tendency to exaggerate. I'm not saying he did or not, I have no idea, but I'm just saying, so you just want to, like, contextualizing, understanding who's writing it, all of these things are really important. And I mean, the biggest thing, what I came across, and a good example of that would be, I was looking into why Michael Jordan retired in 1992. Yeah. And there was all these conspiracy theories that he had something to do with his father's death. Michael was known to gamble. His father had been murdered 2.5 months before Michael retired. And there's all this information out there, and you could say, oh, Michael's gambling is thus tied to his father's death, but they were just dots. People weren't connecting them. And so I realized that it was nothing more than this crazy conspiracy theory. But what I also realized while researching was that one of the 2 guys who were convicted for James Jordan's death, Daniel Green, has been in jail for almost 25 years and is not responsible for the murder. Yeah. And so I then went down and visited him in prison twice, speak to him probably, once a day, I'd say. And it's like and no one it's crazy to me because no one covers it. And it's like, he's one of 10, many.
And you got the first interview in 8 years, I think, with him, right? You were the first person to reach out to him, or was it that you couldn't get to him? What was the story there?
No, I was like, I mean, that's what makes life sometimes. You're like, what? Like, I'm reading up on this story. I'd done a documentary about a wrongful incarceration a few years ago. Yeah. And another project that was about this one guy that we helped bring attention to, and he got out after 20 years. And so I'm reading about Michael Jordan and him retiring, his dad's passing. And I just, like, again, you want to read and contextualize and understand as much as you can. And I'm looking into his dad's trial. I'm sorry, the 2 guys who were convicted of his father's murder. I'm looking at the trial, and I'm like, wait a second, this doesn't make... And so then I start reading up on more facts, different motions, get a hold of the trial transcript. And, you were talking like thousands of pages, lots of reading. So then I figure out who his lawyer is. Yeah. I call his lawyer. This guy's name is Daniel Green, and there's a change.org petition that a friend of mine set up. So if you look up Daniel Green and James Jordan on change.org, it'll come up. And I called his lawyer, Daniel Green's lawyer, and I said, what's going on? He's so clearly innocent of murder. And she goes, I know, that's why I'm representing him. And I said, well, why won't he do an interview? And she said, what do you mean? I said, he hasn't been interviewed in 8 years. And she said, people are too afraid to touch it. They're just scared of this topic. And like, they wouldn't believe that someone is wrongfully incarcerated for the father of a guy, the most famous guy in the world at the time. How could someone get that wrong? Yeah, yeah. So that kind of breaks your heart. And so I was like, well, I'll come down and interview him. And again, like, thankfully the Cadence 13 team, and this is where you become thankful of a great team that supports you and don't think you're crazy, because they're, what do you mean no one's interviewed in 8 years? So yeah, that was the first interview he did in 8 years, and hopefully he gets more to come. He's already done 1 or 2, I think.
There's a lot in there that I want to jump on, but we did just mention Cadence 13 and $7. Working with them, has that generally been the experience compared to maybe in the past, where it's whatever your creative ambition might have been, they're there to support you and help you grow that? What's that experience been like working with, like, Danny and Dwayne and all these guys?
They're efficiency. Yeah. Like, there's a reason Dwayne Johnson is the biggest star in the world. Yeah. And Danny Garcia is this prolific producer. In that, you see it in emails, like just the efficiency, which I nerd out on. I'm like, I just like love. It's just, you send an email and it's like 2 minutes later, it's here's what you were asking for and so much more. And so it's not a mistake. You're like, okay, these guys put in some serious time. And then in terms of the storytelling, they've been really helpful at a bird's eye view. Because I can get lost in the weeds. I'm like, in 1981, this happened, and then 6 months later, and then 3 months later, but to know that, you got to go 5 months back. And they're like, whoa, 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 relax, home. You know, like, just tell us, like, what era we're in, and remind us who the characters are, and if we're really, you know, get into it as crazy as you are, we'll go look it up. And that's very helpful in storytelling in general, is just, like, keeping that bird's eye view and not getting too lost in your own mind.
To that end, talking about getting lost in it or getting lost in the weeds, when you were describing the Michael Jordan episode, you're right, there's so many layers and so many different conspiracies, and you uncover this thing, and that leads to another thing and all that. And then amidst all this, you discover the Daniel Green thing, which is its own rabbit hole. How do you stay focused in that moment? Do you then go, okay, I got to come back to this? Do you fall down that hole and then pull yourself back out? What does that look like in that moment of discovery?
That's a good question. Well, I think it's a great question. I don't know if I have the right answer. I mean, I've always looked at it as, and this might sound a little cheesy, so I apologize, but I've always looked at it as if your story, if the way that you thought your story was going to go in the beginning of the process is the same at the end of the process. If your story is the same as you thought it would be at the end as it was in the beginning, then you weren't listening in between. And so I always think if I have the same story that I thought I was going to have in the beginning, then I was thinking too narrow-minded or I was being too linear. And so I think it's important to go down rabbit holes and sidetrack, because you don't know where that may lead. And if you're too precious about sticking to your narrative, then I think it becomes stale and it becomes something that maybe has already been explored. So I think there is a certain checkpoint where you're like, okay, I've now learned way too much about this facet, and it's, you know, but you note it, you keep it in a folder, you never know, you might go back to it. And then there's certain things where just morally, like Daniel Green, where you'd feel like, again, this is a little cheesy, but like, I wasn't gonna like put that story aside, you know? I had to come back to that just because the guy's been in jail for 25 years.
Yeah, he's been put aside for 25 years.
And will be for the rest of his life unless we collectively do something.
Well, that brings me to my curiosity surrounding season 2. When you've done wrongful incarceration stories before, and you've worked hard to right these wrongs and help these people, when you come across something like Daniel Green at this late in the process, does it influence your decisions regarding stories in season 2? Does it become hard to be like, well, let me spend an episode on like a Britney or something, when you know there's so many people out there? Or do you need those Britneys sort of as a break from those stories? How does that work when it comes time to do that?
So the weird facet of it all is, so we did an episode on Britney Spears, and it was about her meltdown. Well, and this is important, meltdown 10 years ago. Yeah. And I thought it would be one of our, and this is my own, ignorance, was I thought it would be a lighter episode. It'd be this kind of like, this train wreck that 10 years ago kind of lost her mind, and the paparazzi were going crazy. And boy, was I like so stupid and in the wrong and morally off. Like, what we did to Britney Spears 10 years ago is terrible. Yeah. And she was 18 years old, and we were doing really perverted, disgusting things to her. And there's also just so much more research these days about the prefrontal cortex and how your mind is still developing into your mid to late 20s. And there's a wonderful book by this woman, Sadie Doyle, named Trainwreck, which put everything in Anyway, long story long here. It's weird. I will try and find lighter topics. And maybe I'm just I need to, like season 2, I really want to do an episode on John Carter, the movie. Okay. Oh, remember that? Yeah. So Andrew Stanton, right? Andrew Stanton directed it. Taylor Kitsch was,
Oh yeah, all about it.
They put $250 million into that movie. Gone. How do you spend $250 million on a movie
And all the pieces were there. I mean, Andrew Stanton, phenomenal director,
two-time Academy Award winner.
Yeah, dude.
It was
Pitch
based
was a
on
big enough name. You don't know. I can't
Matt,
wait to hear this.
What really happened?
I can't wait to find out.
And knowing me, though, I'll find out that like Taylor's brother is like there's something. You know, I got to just try and make it about that and not about something that gets too dark. Hopefully.
Yeah.
But yeah, no. It's important to keep a balance and not make it too serious all the time. So John Carter, I know more. I've watched them, and the movie's not that bad either, by the way.
It's not a bad movie.
No,
just didn't happen.
People who review movies sometimes, man, I'll tell you.
That definitely played a role in it, I think, for sure. Well, it's fascinating, but I don't think you'll ever run out of things to investigate. Because even with something like when I, Tonya came out, the number of people I talked to that were like, it's so crazy. I thought Tonya Harding did it. Like everybody in their mind, even if they lived through it, they just had this perception of, and we just accepted it and moved on with our lives, and that's what we knew about Tonya Harding, was she grabbed a pipe and hit somebody in the leg, and that's it. Yeah. And it's like, I'm not stating that I, Tonya is a documentary film. It's obviously, there's dramatized and all that sort of stuff, or dramatized. But my point is, there's all these moments in history where we just kind of think we know how it worked. Even with the Ali story in my head, I was like, well, yeah, he could do anything. Of course he did that. And then I listened to your show, and I was like, well, that makes a lot more sense.
To your point, it's like, think of the history books that we read in high school.
Yeah.
And just what hogwash they were. Did you ever read, can you imagine ever reading an American history textbook and closing the chapter and being like, I don't know if America did the right thing there. Yeah. Like it's we're given, and that's true in everything. So I think it's, no matter what you read, it needs to be done through a certain lens. And the Tonya Harding example. And then it's also not just how we lived through it, but how we go about celebrating the anniversary, right? So like Princess Diana, she passed away 20 and a half years ago, I guess you would say. And so there was all these anniversaries last August, commemorating and celebrating, but they all sucked. Like they were really cheesy and bad. And there was slow music, and there was these people that would say Princess Diana was a light in the world, and then she found the end of her life at the light at the end of a tunnel. And you're like, man, you guys are so worried about clever metaphors. You're not talking about all the incredible work that she did and the terrible way she was treated by so many people and the lasting impact she's had on not just England, but the world, how ahead of her time she was. So I think it's, I don't want to be too cynical, but it's also a matter of like how we interpret time periods, certain people, and then how we want to go about deciding to commemorate them for good or for better or worse. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's a reason this show was #1 in iTunes, man. Like you do something.
Dwayne Johnson.
Well, didn't hurt. Did not hurt. But also the stories you're telling, the way in which you're delivering the information, the context you put. Context is king, man. And that's just it. You're not ever giving an opinion or a one-sided or unbiased or biased. You're just telling what happened, and what happened is interesting as it is. That's the interesting part, is the truth. And I think a lot of people are hungry for the truth, and that's why this show's resonated. We got to go to audience in a second, but I'd be remiss not to talk about, you got your first live show coming up.
Yes.
Part of the NYC Podfest. Very exciting. You've never done a live show with this before.
No.
So
I have not.
That reaction tells me a lot.
Yeah.
I imagine you're excited going into it. How are you approaching it differently than you would your studio show? What are you trying to do this time?
So for about an hour and a half, I'm going to explain how I went from looking into why the Michael Jordan, who's in 1992 especially, is much bigger than sports, was by far the most famous person in the world at the time. Absolutely. How I went from trying to understand why he retired to ending up in a prison interviewing a guy wrongfully convicted of murder, and the two being totally unrelated in many ways, and how you go about like getting there. Right. And so it's me sort of delivering a podcast, if you will, but I'll be showing on a screen all of the different research involved, the different videos that I've gone through, and so it's kind of like a behind-the-scenes look at how the podcast is made over the course of several months, but within about an hour and 20 minutes.
That's pretty
Is
cool.
the goal.
That's pretty cool, man.
Yeah.
All right.
And you can get tickets
where can you
at Podfest, nycpodfest.com.
Perfect. I did promise audience Q&A, but there's also one question I really wanted to ask you. On your Instagram, you had a video of your progress. It was like all these papers, like a mountain, just like an endless stream. What was that? What is that part of your process? What were you doing there?
So, yeah. What really happened? I was. So each episode usually ends up around probably 15,000 words, and so I had come home after recording one of the episodes, and I was just looking at the pages, and then I was trying to sort out if I could have kind of reverse engineered 2 of the acts, if you will. So I laid it out each page, because normally I have note cards, and I also have a wall of mine that's just painted where you can like it's dry erase board wall essentially. And so I laid out probably about 50 pages and tried to figure out how it would have looked if I had changed a few pages around. And it was a Friday night at like 11:30 p.m. and I was looking at my apartment and I had like it was actually 2 drafts, I think. So it was probably, or 3, it was a lot of drafts that, yeah, it looked really weird. And so I decided, I posted that on Instagram.
I thought I was fascinated
really
by it. It was crazy.
Yeah.
I was like, this is either really interesting or Andrew's lost his mind.
Yeah.
This goes one.
That was a lost his mind thing, but it was a cool way to look at the story. And it's hard sometimes when you're done. You always can make it better. You know, it's like you never finish. You just kind of run out of time. Yeah. But I got to let it go sometimes. So that would be a good example.
For sure. Yeah. All right, well, let's do it. I promise we'll turn it over. Audience Q&A. We've got a microphone in the room. Our first question's right here.
So when you're putting research into stories that you want to cover for what really happened, is there any story that you've ran into that you just haven't been able to find information
on? Yes. So, and this is a weird, this might sound strange. I really want to know how Beyonce kept Lemonade a secret so well. I find that the thousands of people involved, all it takes is one person. Yeah. That's it, to just say something. And so I've looked around, and I know some people, you know, and those NDAs are serious.
Ironclad.
Like ironclad. Obviously, Trump doesn't have the same like. Beyonce could teach Trump a thing or two about NDAs.
I think more than just NDAs, probably, but that especially.
Well put. Yes. So a very extremely bizarre answer. I was not but I'm curious how this day and age someone like that can keep a secret. And so far the answer has been a simple sentence, which is the NDAs are as powerful as a.
Not much of a whole episode, huh? Yeah,
it'd be that'd be it. But so I'll try and think if there's like a more serious answer than Beyonce Lemonade, but that's what came to mind.
Yeah, it's a good answer. It's interesting. We have time for a few more questions. 2 more. The next one's going to be, I think, right here.
Yeah, you mentioned that sometimes people's perception is that podcasts are easier to create than other forms of production, and obviously there are so many facets: the writing, the researching, the production. But what have you found in your experience is the most challenging part of creating a podcast?
That's a good question. The most challenging part of creating a podcast would be, I think it's you're able to be less precious in a podcast with time and your storytelling. So in a documentary, it's always just in a movie documentary, it's just like story, and to like veer off for 2 or 3 minutes into another topic, you can't really do. It's just. But with a podcast, you're given that flexibility, which is really cool. So if I want to go and talk about something that's a little bit of a sidetrack, I can do that. There's not an act break. There's no commercial. There's nothing of that nature. So with that said, sometimes like an empty canvas is the hardest thing to paint on, and so I have to be able to know where I'm telling a fun side story, but I'm not going too far and not making it. People are like, wait, what's this about again? And I think that's been the toughest part, is also reminding myself that people are doing other things while they're listening. Yeah. So you can't, like, you got to relax on any sense of ego. It's like most people are probably listening to this while they're hearing a lot of other things. They're in a subway, they're in a train, they're driving, they're looking at their phone, they're maybe at work pretending to do work, you know, they're cleaning their house. So it's also making sure that everything is just crystal clear, whereas in a documentary film, I would obsess, you obsess over every frame, how it looks, every image. And so it's like a fine balance of, I don't know if that perfectly answered the question, but it's like a fine balance of making the most of the platform, but not abusing it.
It's really interesting that I never thought of the whole picture. Whereas, yeah, when you do have the 100%, you have the visual element. You know that you have a captive audience, that you have their undivided attention. But I never thought of it from the other side, that like you have to be aware that you have half of your audience, just like you have half of your skills, because that visual, they're out somewhere else.
You gotta earn it,
yeah,
which is what I like.
Bring them in.
If someone does, they're like, I don't want to listen to you. Yeah. I'm going to work now. I don't want to listen to you. Like, I'm going to listen to 1,000 other things that I could be listening to, which I kind of like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. We have time for, looks like, one more question. It's going to be right here.
Hi. So I know you have a background in documentary filmmaking. Did you also study journalism while you were before you went into documentary, or did you consult with journalists before you started the podcast?
That's a great question. So I didn't bring it up, but I normally do. I am very clear in, and people will still call me this, but I don't consider myself a journalist. I am a documentary filmmaker, and the difference, or a documentary podcaster, the difference is in documentaries you're forced to manipulate story like that, and that's just a fact. If you have 200 hours of footage and you have to make that a 90-minute movie, you have to manipulate footage so that it makes any sort of sense. Similar with a podcast. And so for the podcast, because it's called What Really Happened, and I really need to understand facts from the right sources, I speak, and have been extremely lucky to speak with experts, biographers, and journalists on every topic. And if I don't, then we don't do it. So Princess Diana, we talked to Andrew Morton, who wrote like the Princess Diana book in 1992 that turned out she co-wrote essentially. Talked with Tina Brown, who wrote the Diana Chronicles. I taught for the Jordan ones, Sam Smith, Bob Ryan. I mean, I could go through, and that's been, like, I'm very grateful for. It's just been an incredible process to speak with these acclaimed journalists and be able to get information from them while also getting it from a million other sources. So no, I didn't. I went to NYU Film School for a year, and then I made a movie about living in a nursing home. But no, didn't go to journalism school.
You ever get really intimidated before you have to talk to one of these journalism like giants, like one of these guys that have done this for years, or do you know I'm coming from a different angle, I'm coming from a different space, and I know what I want to get?
With journalists, I always with anyone I interview, I read up on everything they've done. Yeah. So if, like, I talk to the biographer of a Chris Christie book. So I didn't just read his articles. I didn't just read his book. I listened to his TED Talk. I listened to every interview he's ever done, and that way they respect that you really care. And I think if you show you've put in the time, then they're no matter how dumb your questions may be, they're willing to.
At least it's not for lack of trying.
Exactly.
Like you put in the effort, you did the homework, you showed respect by doing that.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah.
Man, I could talk to you all day, dude. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I got to let you go, but let's talk about all the things. What Really Happened, available on iTunes. You can subscribe.
So
Season 2.
What Really Happened is on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify.
Everywhere there's podcasts.
If there's a podcast, yeah.
Yeah, you can find it there.
Yeah.
April 8th, you're doing the live show. Head to NYC Podfest.
NYCpodfest.com in New York City, or if
Yeah.
you go to my Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, all the information is on there as well.
And it's just your name, right? At Andrew Jenks?
At Andrew Jenks.
At Andrew Jenks.
Yeah.
I didn't even get to talk to you about the amazing All-American Film Festival. Do you want to say anything about that before we get out of here? I think it's fantastic.
So when I was in high school, I always had these little movies that I wanted to play, and I'd play them in my parents' basement with 2 of my friends or something. We started a little film festival. Now, fast forward 12 years later, it's the All-American High School Film Festival. You can go to hsfilmfest.com. We've given out over $1 million in scholarships and prizes to high school students. We play their movies at the AMC theaters in Times Square. We have a college fair of 30 colleges that come and try and recruit these kids. Submissions from over 50 countries, and it's awesome. It's a nonprofit. We're always trying to raise money. If anyone wants to reach out, we're at HS Film Fest on Twitter.
Andrew, do me a favor. Get some sleep.
Yeah, I will.
Unbelievable. Thank you so much for making time to hang out with us. Guys, make some noise one more time. Thank you to Andrew Jenks.
Thank you.
That's perfect.
Thank you.